Okay, so that's it, we're live. So this is the very first Polyglot Talks on My Language Challenge. Today we've got Gareth Popkins. Okay, so that's it, we're live. One moment. So this is the very first, sorry, it came up in YouTube again. So I was getting the audio from that. So Gareth's going to do a short talk for us today. So rather than listen to me, I'll hand you over to Gareth.
Thanks a lot, Gary. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me. I feel somewhat overwhelmed to be the first speaker. Yeah, my name's Gareth Popkins from howtogetfluent.com. I've been blogging about language learning for the last 4 years. I've been learning languages for about 30 years. I started with French, the usual story, at school, and went on to learn Welsh and German and Russian. More recently, I've dabbled in other languages, but I've been working on Basque. And also now I've started learning Japanese, and I've done some language teaching in my time too, both of English and Welsh. I go to a lot of polyglot events and talk to a lot of language learners. And one of the things you realize, I think, pretty quickly is that there are many, many different methods which people use when they're learning a language, to do with mainly, I think, your personality, whether you're more the introverted, perhaps hard-focused, studious type, cautious type, socially maybe, and those who are more extrovert and like to dive straight in, work it out as they go, build the parachute on the way down sort of thing. And there are differences. Do people like to use textbooks? Do they find that's too restrictive? Do they like to use a lot of video materials or not? Do they want to use technology? A gamut of methods, but I think there are similarities too. If you take a step back, there are certain things that we all need to do, that we all need to know when we learn a language. And fundamentally, I think our brains, in some senses, as regards learning, are all very similar too. People talk about learning styles, but from what I've been reading, that is to some extent perhaps a bit of a red herring, perhaps a bit exaggerated, because forming the neural connections, the memories, getting the active skill of language, of acquiring new speech, really, is, it seems, more or less the same for everybody, you know, in many important ways. So even if, as I say, we all have different, you know, preferences into things we're actually doing. So what I've been doing is trying to think and isolate principles which I see all successful language learners applying in maybe in varied ways, but under the surface. And I wanted to talk today about one of those, and I've called it the idea of tuning in to your foreign language. So that's the topic that I want to talk about today. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, there are three aspects to this, I think. The first one is what I'd call the soundscape of the language. So it's literally the idea of tuning in your ears and your brain to how the language sounds. And then the second one is tuning in to the way the language is used socially. This is what the linguists call the pragmatics of using a language. And I'll go on to look at that a bit briefly and explain what that is and what you can do to make sure you're not making sort of social faux pas with your language. You're not embarrassing yourself by, for example, using the wrong form, impolite or informal or polite form, vous tu, when you're learning French, something like that. And then the final aspect of tuning in is the cultural one. Pragmatic sort of blends into that, but it's knowing about the culture that comes with the language that you're learning. And that, of course, is a multifarious thing as well. But to really understand and to succeed in communicating, you need not only the sounds, not only the social conventions, but you need a whole lot of context, and that's the culture. So those are the three aspects of this tuning in aspect as a guiding principle of language learning. So I'll start first with a little bit about the first one, which is what I called the soundscape. Now, language is sound, obviously, at the most fundamental level. You can get fluent in a language and by being illiterate. Of course, that's the way that all of us learned our first language. And to my mind, it's very good advice to take how your language sounds and learning to pronounce the language well, to get the intonation right, to take that really, really seriously. And some language learners, like to put a lot of emphasis, certainly at the beginning, on getting those fundamentals right. And then I think I like to do that, even though it's a bit boring and frustrating if you've got a textbook. One is tempted to skip over the first pre-chapter on pronunciation, for example. But I think it does pay off, because if you are difficult to understand, it's going to make it hard for people to help you, actually, because it's frustrating for them, particularly when our first language is English, and many people speak English quite well as a second language. They might switch into English, but also not only in a conversation, but if you're listening, of course, and that's one of the ways of getting a lot of audio input, building the depth of your knowledge, widening your vocabulary, then you will hear better too if you focus a bit initially on the basic sounds. So whether you do it at the beginning, whether it's something you do later, or whether it's something that you come back to, and that I think is another good useful tip, that you can have just a corrective session occasionally. If you do if you work with a tutor, you can just maybe have one session where just for half an hour, or even a shorter time, you speak and they pick up certain aspects of your pronunciation which they feel that you could work on. Or you can ask a friend, a native speaker friend, to help you with that too, because generally people you're speaking to will probably accept in that context, be polite, and they will not be correcting your pronunciation necessarily, because, you know, either that they're not thinking about that, or that they don't want to offend you. So one of the key things in a soundscape is the elemental sounds, the so-called the phonemes, the contrastive sounds. Language is built up of contrasts, in a way, of sound, and you have elemental sounds which may or may not be present in English. So and then in the language that you're learning, the sound may be cut up, if you like, in different ways, packaged in different ways. This is partly acoustic, but it's partly also what the brain is tuned into. And if like in Spanish, for example, I know Spanish speakers, I know when they're speaking English, they tend to mix up B and V. So they talk about video. I say you've got to, don't mix your vowels with your vowels, I say to my Catalan housemate, because this distinction B and V in Spanish is not a contrastive phonemic difference. They're what they call allophones of the same phoneme. So this distinction doesn't matter for meaning. Whereas in English, there's a big difference between vowel and vowel, between ship and sheep, these sounds, the E sound, which doesn't exist in Spanish. Likewise, in other languages, we have two versions of L in the word in an English pronunciation, little. Our brains tell us that's the same sound at the beginning and at the end. But actually, it isn't. I'm not an expert of phonetics, but the second one is different from the first one. And in some languages like Polish, that distinction is important for meaning. So the word starts with one of the L's or starts with the other L, it changes the meaning. So you need to focus in on that, read the pronunciation section of your book, learn about these things and work on them occasionally. And then it's the same with stress, you know. So where is there a stress pattern in your language? English has stress on different syllables that can move. In French, you tend to stress each syllable more or less equally. And that's a great way to sound like a French person if you give the same emphasis to every syllable in the sentence, yeah? And once you're aware of that, you can start doing what's required of you in your language. In Russian that I learned, the stress is a nightmare, is mobile stress, they call it, so that it moves. We have that sometimes in English, don't we, to distinguish between a noun and a verb. But in Russian, the stress can move according to whether it's a plural or the case that it's in, and it's an irregular thing. There's something you want to be aware of and to focus on. Consonant combinations as well, they can differ. So, for example, We have consonant clusters at the end of a sentence in English. In Cantonese, you don't have that. So they might say girl, because to say girl, girl, two consonants at the end is difficult for them. I have this again all the time with my Catalan housemate, that she is not saying a double consonants at the end of a word in English, because she's not used to it. When I'm speaking Basque, I'm using a long R at the end. I'm sort of diphthongizing the R at the end, because in English that's what we tend to do, whereas it should say short. And so be aware of the differences between your own language and the one you're learning. The same with the rhythm of the language, as I mentioned, with the intonation. The meaning of intonation can differ between languages. We can raise our intonation for a question. In Hungarian, the intonation falls at the end. There's a bit of a down and up at the end. And then also, you know, tones. Some languages have tones. Chinese, Cantonese, some African, Zulu has tones, 2 tones. So those are things you need to focus in on too. How connected speech works. That when we're speaking syllables in the whole word, we sometimes crunch the syllables. So, for example, Birmingham we say in English, the place name, not Birmingham. So the A at the end, Birmingham, just about disappears. It's the sort of thing you might not notice. Find out what's going on in your own language. So that's the soundscape. And then the second is pragmatics of the language. So the culture of communication, if you like. Find out about rules about eye contact, smiling. When you're actually physically present, how close are you supposed to stand to the other person? In Russia, for example, it's much more normal to stand rather closer than in Britain, where we have more this idea of personal space. We tend to smile a lot more. The Russians or the French, if you smile at people you don't know, they'll think you're up to no good, or you're a bit, you know, weak in the head. What about volume? I keep mentioning my Catalan housemates. There's no doubt the standard volume setting in Spanish and Catalan is higher than it is in British English. What's the speed that you speak? That might change in different parts of the country as well. How much do you speak to people you don't know very well? Modes of address, I mentioned tu and vu are their formal levels of politeness. Japanese is known for this. Learn about those two. Read about them, ask your teacher about them, Google for them. Are there taboo topics? When I was in Russia, my parents came to visit and we were at a friend's house having some food, and they kept asking me to ask my parents how much their pension was. Yeah. Now, in Britain, it's easier to ask somebody about their sex life than it is to ask them how much they earn. Generally, it, for some reason, is a taboo topic to talk about money. And this can be even true within families, among siblings, depends how well you know the person, but find out. And, you know, learn set scripts as well. So it's things like bowing and greetings. How are you? In English, when we say how are you, we don't want the history of the last 2 weeks of your life. Yeah. Learn the conventions. Learn how figurative speech is used. Are you in the right register? So among young men in Russia, the way they speak to each other is different from if one of those young men is talking to his grandmother, to a professor. Learn about register, try and stay in the right register. So that's the soundscape. It's the culture of communication, narrowly understood in terms of the pragmatics. And then the wider culture. A lot of, even if you're really high level, you will be left floundering if you're not familiar with, for example, the geography of the country. You need to know all the place names. Sometimes the adjective may just relate to the place name. And I'm looking in a dictionary and it's actually just a reference to a place name, which might not be there. You need to then know about the history of the country sometimes, because characters, events, institutions may come up in conversations or colour the discourse in some way. A quick way in is to read Wikipedia articles. You could do it in the language if you're good enough, but in English if you're not. A quick potted history. You know, obviously the more you travel in the country, read about it in your own language too, the more you'll have to go on. Learn a bit about its institutions too. The things like military service, or, you know, it's got some cooperative economic tradition. These things might be referred to. Kibbutz, for example, was a big thing in Israel. Try and learn about these religious aspects too, because there's going to be vocabulary perhaps which will come in. And then proverbs and sayings, which might be linked with getting to know the literature of the country, getting to know films of the country. It might even be phrases which we call sort of winged phrases, which come from advertising, for example. But these then might be used in the language only partially. So you might just say the end of a phrase. So if I say, you know, it takes two, it was partly his fault. There's this phrase, it takes two to tango in English. You might not hear that whole phrase. And then you might be left not understanding what on earth it's about. Now, obviously, it takes a long time and a lot of engagement to develop that sort of depth of understanding. But finding a way, and no one can know it all, but it's a great feeling of being in the in crowd when you do get certain references. I like to use newspaper headlines for this. They can be, you know, I can sometimes see a newspaper headline in London when I'm going into the underground, where you have to know one show that was on telly 15 years ago and one catchphrase. Otherwise, even if your English is perfect, you won't be able to understand the joke or the wordplay of the headline. Now, in a way, that's a bit depressing. So remember, if you can't understand, though, on the other hand, it might not be something that's wrong with your language. It might be something that's just coming from the wider culture. And so it's about long-term engagement, taking an interest, and really living the language. So those are the three things, for me, of the tuning in principle, that to me are characteristic of successful language learners and communicators, whatever specific methods they're using. It's that they really take the sound and the pronunciation and the intonation of the language seriously. They keep going back to it. They're interested in the way, the conventions around how language is used, how speech is used, how people interact with each other. And they're also right in there, swimming around, floundering around in the wider culture, going into it through the bits that they're interested in. You don't have to suddenly become interested in opera in Italian if you're not interested in opera in English necessarily. But get involved as fully as you can, whichever way in works for you, to start to understand the wider culture as well. Okay.
Excellent. So quick question for me. So you've mentioned those three pillars. Would you say that runs in order of how competent you are in the language? So you start with the soundscape, then move on to the social and cultural, or would you say it's something that you learn a little bit all the time as you go?
I think it's the latter. There is sometimes the view that you should get the hang of the language first before you start worrying about social niceties and so on. And it's true that often I'm starting to learn Japanese at the moment, and they're teaching us one level of politeness, sort of pretty neutral, erring on the side of caution towards politeness first, on the ground it's better to be too polite than not polite enough. But already there are things you can be learning from the very beginning. And yeah, you keep going around. It's sort of like a spiral, it seems to me. You're going over the same territory, but getting wider as you go many, many times and building it up. But maybe if you can start with some serious work on the sounds before you actually start learning anything at all. I know some people just don't like to do that, and if not, then don't do it. But the main thing is to get started. But a lot of the most successful language learners and the most serious language learning programs do put a lot of emphasis on attuning to sounds initially. One of the hardest things actually is not new sounds which don't exist in your language. Like in Welsh, we've got the eh sound. It is in Russian, there's an oi, which is different from the English e. It's where they exist in your language, but as we say, they're allophones of the same phoneme. So it's this v distinction, because there your brain it's obvious if there's something you've never heard before. The part of the mouth or the articulatory equipment being used that we don't use in English. You know, Arabic has these more guttural, and Dutch as well, sound that we don't have in speech, although we may make those sounds at certain times. And you know, those are the difficult ones, not the ones that are new, but the ones that are distinctions that aren't made in our own language. These two L sounds in English, for example, the light and the dark. And I think in Gaelic, actually, Scottish Gaelic, Gary, that difference exists as well.
Okay. Any questions for anybody else? Feel free.
For me, I'm learning Japanese as well, and I don't find pronunciation particularly difficult, except maybe I mess up the R and the L a little bit. But trying to figure out pitch is very difficult because I can't find it in the dictionary. So for me, it's just constantly listening and repeating to see if I'm pronouncing things correctly. But in the beginning, without listening a lot, I could pick out occasional words in a sentence. It's getting easier now for me to be able to follow what's going on. It's not just the last word I hear at this point, which it was for a long time. But everything else that you've spoke about, I think for me right now is just way beyond me. I can barely get through a casual conversation, let alone worry about saying the wrong word, because I do that all the time. And probably like what you mentioned as well, I'm really only able to speak in sort of that standard polite form. I know sort of restaurant level politeness, I suppose, but it's impossible for me to speak casually as if I was talking to friends. And it's not really a focus for me right now because I don't have any. So I assume it's just for travel, and I should just be a fairly polite person. So I haven't worried about that so much, but pitch has been difficult, I think, just to make sure that I'm figuring that one out correctly.
Have you started, so when did you start, and what course? Are you using an audio-based course like Pinsler or?
No, I've been using, well, textbooks, but I also use Glossica. So if you've used that one, it's...
Yeah, I know about Glossica. I haven't used it. But so which textbook are you using for Japanese? Because I started Japanese in January, so...
oh, I have a couple. I have Japanese for busy people. I've gone through that one. And, well, I have another one. I can't remember the name of it right now.
I haven't even got to pitch yet, so I mean, I know about it, of course, but I'm using Japanese for zero, and it hasn't been introduced yet.
Yeah.
But you say that you are not at that level, but of course, things like bowing or being aware of the different registers of speech.
Oh, for sure, I'm aware. Yes.
Yeah. So what I've been saying, obviously, in a way, yeah, I was pitching it to some extent at the more advanced levels, but I think there's still a lot which we can read about and find out about it, even when it's aspirational for us still. Certainly, you know, things like cultural references and so on are very difficult until you're at the moving to the upper intermediate level. I accept that, but there's a lot that we can do, and my tendency is to sort of hit the books and to neglect audio myself. I'm as guilty as anybody of that. So I'm trying to practice what I preach in terms of really working on the sounds. Although Japanese is one of the languages which is known as, apart from the pitch accent, because it's a sound, what they call rather cruelly a sound poor language. It says in my book, anyone can sound good in Japanese, and it's much harder for the poor Japanese trying to learn languages like English. These distinctions, you mentioned the L and the R, yeah? And yeah, the Japanese one is somewhere in between the two. But they suddenly, in English, have to, you know, loot and root there is basically the same, but the difference at the beginning is crucial for the meaning, and it must be a nightmare for them. So when I'm being tortured by their writing systems, I sort of tell myself, well, they have it hard as well, actually, in different ways. And they're coming in the other direction.
Any other questions?
Has anybody made any sort of big social faux pas in the way that they use language? Any war stories so far?
So my only big one so far has been the double consonants in Italian, like using penny instead of penny, which means some. So instead of saying pens, what I said was penis. So yeah, and it's the same with anno and anno, and yeah, I've done the first time I did that first one was in a lesson with my tutor, and she was quite a quiet, shy woman. So when I said it, I didn't actually know what I'd done wrong, but she went bright red, and it actually took about 5 minutes before I found out what I'd done. So
yes,
yeah. It was quite amusing though.
Yeah.
In that scenario anyway, because it was only between me and a tutor rather than in a social situation.
And we are cut some slack, you know, because we're foreigners. So that's something to remember as well, I suppose. It's yeah, talking about the Italians though, they of course they tend to put a vowel at the end of each word because they don't want to have the same consonant combinations as in English, that they often don't have a word ending in a consonant, you know, so they have to put the vowel in. They just can't help it. They can't even hear they're doing it. Spanish speakers will often, before the s, sh or sp, they put in an a Spanish. I am a Spanish. Yeah, I'm going to the S station. Yeah, because this S sound at the beginning in Spanish apparently always has the E before it. So our key is two things we can take from that. One is when you're learning a language, you will not know, unless you've learned a few and found out about this, what you're doing automatically with because you're English. It's like me, oso ona in Basque means very good. I will say oso ona, because in English this a at the end tends to be longer. And it's and it's much shorter really than we have at the end, it turns out. I didn't know, my teacher pointed it out in English. So I'm making this classic English speakers make mistake. The other way we can play this is, so I was doing this very bad fake Italian accent earlier on, but a good tip is to play the stage Frenchman when you're speaking French. So exaggerate the accent almost to the level that you feel that someone's going to hit you because you're taking the piss. Yeah. And they won't, because it feels really exaggerated to you because you're not used to holding your mouth and your muscles in a different way. You have to do this and then the accent. And then you think you are being ridiculous, but they will tell you, obviously, context is everything. Actually, you're sounding really good because it feels to you like an exaggerated effort. And so you have to sort of imagine your way in and just not be embarrassed about it, I think. Or again, if there's someone you know quite well, you can say, well, if I speak like this, does it sound better? If you're still not sure, get some confidence. But if you can, and also lock into, try and model yourself on someone who's sort of similar to you in terms of age and background in a way. You don't want to end up sounding, you know, like an old lady if you're a building worker, or the other way around. First, just because it's incongruous, but also it's often easier for you then to identify, to open this new window on your personality, which is what to me a new language is. Rather than new personality, it's a different aspect of your own personality, but it does need to link up to your own personality.
Yeah, and sorry. All right, on you go, Paula.
Hello, Paula.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
Like you said, like we have to realize what we do in our own language. what if I haven't realized what I do in my own language to start like improving my pronunciation in the others? I am a Spanish native speaker.
Yes.
I
Yeah, you could just Google typical Spanish, do it in Spanish, speakers pronunciation problems with English, something like that. And you will find, I've mentioned some of them already, the initial consonant, it's not doing the, so take the word band, which could mean in English, it's, you know, either forbidden or a brass band or a pop group. My Spanish friends will always say ban, ban. And I have to say banad, banad. And they have to, and they feel that they're really exaggerating it in such a way that it cannot be normal, when actually they're only just about then approximating to what it should sound like to me. So that's another one. But you'll be able to find quite quickly a list. But you don't even really necessarily have to do it at that abstract level. You can just, you know, if you're working with a teacher, say, could you, I'm just going to read something out to you. I'm just going to tell you for 5 minutes now what I've been doing this morning. And as I speak, could you just jot down, note down the main weaknesses with my accent? Yeah. Oh. And then the teacher will be able to point them out to you. And then even if the teacher's not a trained pronunciation specialist, you can then take that list and then maybe do a bit of Googling. Or you, I mean, there are also people who work as specialist pronunciation trainers. That can be quite pricey. But you can find people. For example, a Russian friend of mine recently, we did this for about an hour. So he's a very good friend, and we just had a conversation. And she wanted help with her English. Well, it's very good, her English. She works at professional level. She's a lawyer through the medium of English, so she's that good. But she still sounds very Russian. And so she wanted me to help her. But again, I was saying it's not about hiding, and I should have said this, hiding where you're from, because we've all got to come from somewhere. And so, and that's good, because otherwise we'd have massive psychological and identity problems. You want to be, Paola, from wherever you are, who has learned your target language really well. And you also want to be lower down the scale when you're at a lower level, you know, someone people can understand. Yeah. And not someone, oh, I asked her to tell me it 3 times and I still couldn't understand. It was so embarrassing. We switched back to Spanish or whatever, you know, because so it's the key things you need, and it's to get right. It's not everything, so that, you know, you don't have to sound like a native. You need to get various key things right.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, just on that one as well. So I've been having a few problems with pronunciation in Gaelic, which is what I'm doing at the moment. So one of the things that my tutor's doing with me is when we're going through the materials, she'll read it out and get me to repeat. And we do that a few times for each thing. And I've got her permission to record every lesson. So there's times where I'll say something and she'll go, no, that's not quite right. It's this. And she'll say it again. And I'll say it again. And to me, I've just said exactly the same thing. It doesn't sound any different. We'll do it a few times and then eventually she'll go, yeah, that's much better. And it's not until I listen back, I can actually hear the difference each time. And then I can pick out my mistakes. So that I think that helps as well, just recording lessons and actually getting your tutor to focus on pronunciation, even if it's only an occasional lesson, because no one wants a tutor to stop you in your flow every time and go, nope, that was wrong. Nope, that was wrong. So doing it that way is much gentler, but allows me to make those corrections.
And it is about, I say tuning in, but you are retraining your ear to focus on distinctions which your brain has actually been used to ignoring. And because every utterance that we make is a bundle, if you like, of acoustic features, and we just focus on certain aspects of them. And it's a mixture of sound. I'm not a physicist, but that apparently is how it is. So your brain can lock on to certain aspects, and it may not even be aware of others that are going on. If you do want to record your lesson, make sure you check with the teacher first. Some of them do say, I use this side iTalk. I'm sure you guys know about it quite often. Some teachers do say they don't want recording. So obviously it's a sort of personal thing too. You need to make sure you've checked with your teacher. Another thing, there's Rhino Spike, isn't there? Have you used that? Is that still going? It's a site where you can ask people to say things for you to get the pronunciation. Even Google now actually has, in the bigger languages, a sound file with each word that you can use. You can also do a couple of techniques if we're talking about pronunciation. Minimal pair training. The minimal pair is where the only difference is the key phoneme. So I use the example of ship and sheep, vowel, vowel, and you can train the two. And you can buy audio recordings for this as well. The problem is, as Gary says, if they all sound the same to you, so sometimes having somebody else to help, I think can be really a useful thing. And another thing, talking though about the wider phrases and sentences, so moving to intonation, moving to vowels which disappear. I mentioned the A in Birmingham. Or we say the word, or when they reappear, consonants. So in English, we say number 4. You can't hear the R at the end. But in the phrase 4 o'clock, the R reappears, 4 o'clock. You can hear it slightly more. So this sort of thing as well. To get that, the technique of shadowing. Have you come across that? Again, if you Google that, I've got an article on it on how to get fluent, explaining it, where you're actually speaking at the same time. You've got the text in front of you. Let's say it's a little conversation in your textbook. You're reading it out at the same time as the native. And it takes some practice to do this. Just do short bursts, 100 words, something, short conversation. And with practice, you can do that. And that is felt to be very good just for getting your mouth used to making the sounds, and also for the rhythms or lack of rhythms within the whole sentence. So that's a technique you can try every now and again as well.
Yeah, one of the difficulties I'm having with the Gaelic at the moment is, whereas with a lot of the other languages, when I did Thai especially, it has definite stops between words. And in English we do it sometimes, but not other times. In Gaelic, they never do that. So what my tutors actually told me to do is, before I say a sentence, take a deep breath, hold it, and then start to speak. And don't stop until I get to the end. And it seems to be working, but all of the words blend together, and it's totally different. I'm not used to doing, even although as a very fast Scottish speaker, I do tend to blend a lot of my words together. It's even more so with Gaelic, and it's definitely unique.
Gosh, I didn't even know about that. Talking about emphasis as well, it's something I didn't mention, but when you're emphasizing a word, of course, in English we often do this by saying it louder. Yeah. So it was a boy, not a girl. Yeah, it was a boy. It was a boy. We do that in English with the emphasis and the stress on the word. But in other languages, they don't do it that way. So in Russian, there's this particle zh for emphasis. As you could say, malchik zh. You can put that on the end, and you don't do it with the emphasis. In Welsh, you change the word order. So you put, so mae'n fachgen, he is a boy, that's the neutral, but you can put bachgen, the word for boy, at the front. Bachgen, you are, and the verb, form of the verb actually changes there. But you'll often hear people in Welsh English then, they'll say things like, laughing he was in the valleys. In English, we would say he was laughing. No, he wasn't crying, he wasn't just smiling, he was laughing. In Welsh, the Welsh language, you move the verb to the beginning. And so that pattern of speaking, which a native who's grown up in England would never really use, is found in Welsh English. Yeah. And so don't just assume by emphasizing a word the way you would in English, or by using language in Spanish, if that's your native language, in the same way as you would, that it's going to be understood or have the same meaning in the target language, because it might not, and it might send the wrong message actually, sometimes too. So again, it's things I'm mentioning these not to overwhelm people, but to raise consciousness, really. Of course, these are things we can't tackle them all at once. We probably never get it all right, but doesn't mean we can't be better than we were 6 months ago.
So what about you, Michael? How are you finding the sounds and pronunciation for Italian?
Finding them accessible.
Are you on mute?
I'm studying up just too.
No, not hearing you, Michael.
Can't hear you, Michael.
Can you hear me
I think
now?
you're on mute.
Oh, okay. Hold on a second.
Good.
Yeah. No, it's gone again. You were there a second.
Okay, well.
Yeah.
Got
you. Yes.
Yeah. You hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, the takeaway, Italian is going well so far, but I just wanted to say that I think the takeaway that I'm getting is just the importance in so many levels, more than I realized, of, if possible, getting either a great language partner or either an italki community partner or teacher that can not only help with grammar, vocabulary, speaking, but the other things like how your mouth needs to be with certain sounds, like English. People learn English that would say that thing, and they can't say the but you have to use your mouth a certain way. I also wanted to say I don't have a language teacher for Korean, but what I'm doing, just for fun, but I think it might help, is taking the lyrics to these popular songs and singing to them. So I'm listening to them a bunch of times, and then I follow the lyrics, and then I try to sing to them a little more and a little more. It kind of gets my head around just the flow and of how they're expressing themselves. So that's I think if you have a conversation group or a meetup group, that's great. But I think you can only get so far if you've only got yourself in textbooks and sites.
Yeah. Well, if you are just on your own, another thing you can do, of course, is record yourself and try and do a critique on yourself. And you may try that if you're doing this sort of stage exaggeration that I mentioned, because when you just hear it cold a couple of days later, it may actually sound much better to you. But yeah, no, you're right. And of course, if you do work with a teacher on some of these pronunciation aspects, as I said, you'd ask the teacher just to pick out the main points. Yeah, what you want to do is stop bad habits getting rooted rather than the fine tuning. And, I was saying to my Russian friend who speaks very good English, it's sexy to speak English with a Russian accent. Yeah, we like it. But there can be things that are irritating. So I find we've got two E sounds in English, but they is and in bean, say, but they'll use that one, ease, all the time. Big, he's a big man. And I find that quite irritating. So there are certain things which a native teacher might want to tone down, but it's stopping bad habits and so on. As I say, nobody's saying you can want to be even aiming to be perfect at this. It's just about, I think, being more aware. But it's great that I didn't mention music. I am Mr. Non-music. I don't listen to music in English songs. I can't remember lyrics. I mean, I've put the radio on. I feel the same emotional boost when I'm in the shower as anybody else, but I can't tell you who I've been listening to. And that's a bit of a blank unfortunately, with me, because it is so important to so many language learners. And it seems to me it's got to help. And, they talk about engaging different parts of the brain, don't they, too, creatively. It's fun. Some people try and teach language through song, and it all sounds to me like a great idea, but I don't get it. I don't get music in that sense. So I know that's a bit odd. But good on you, Michael. I think, you know, singing along the Korean songs is it's got to be good. Are you going to sing your way fluent, Gary? There's a lot of Gaelic music.
Yeah, I'm not much of a singer either. I'm way too scientific for that. So, yeah. Although, because my reading at the moment is not good, I thought I'd start simple. So I am actually going through Gaelic nursery rhymes at the moment.
Yeah.
Because they're at a simple level. There's lots of audio for them. They've got a rhythm. So it is making it easier. But yeah, I don't think I'll go into full-blown Gaelic song.
Yeah.
I think it's mandatory that you can play a guitar if you can do that anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I listen to a lot of talk radio is what I listen to in my languages. Even if it's native speak like Basque, I've been listening to it for 2 or 3 years. I still can't understand more than a third of it. It's more than I used to be able to. Some people get demotivated by that if there's too much input they don't understand. And they say, of course, it's this idea of what they call zone of proximate development. So speaking just slightly ahead of the level that you're at, so you're stretched a bit, but you're not drowned by it. It's supposed to be the most efficient sweet spot to be in. But yeah, so I tend to have the radio on in my languages. It's always talk radio because I see it as more intense verbal experience. I'm getting more words for my minute than with songs. But maybe actually my brain would feel more, you know, ready to remember if I had a bit more music in my life.
I think my problem with songs as well is I'm quite happy to listen to a song in another language, and quite often I get to the point I've listened to it so much I can sing along, but I've absolutely no idea what I'm singing.
Yeah,
because I've just learned the sounds, not actually learned any vocabulary from it.
But it could be that when you do come to learn that vocabulary, somehow you've been pre-programmed, and that speeds up the process.
Quite possibly.
People often say that about, you know, that it helps people learning English, you know. Although I think it's easy for us English natives to think that English is easier than it actually is. And of course, with young people in other countries, if they're into sort of Anglo-American pop culture, it's the sort of status thing as well, isn't it? It's a cool thing. So they want it much more. So it's motivation, which actually comes from a different place than just the fact that it happens to be music as well as speech. So
what about you, Paola? It's Korean you're doing for this challenge, right? How's that coming along?
I have a very good level in grammar, but my problem is speaking it. I haven't figured out how to think in Korean yet. I went to Korea like a couple of months ago, and I tried to speak with people, but in Korean it was very, very hard to me. I had a better time in Japan because my Japanese is much better. But I can't figure out how to speak in Korean, like how to think in Korean. It seems like I can reach that level yet. I don't know how to break through that.
And what was the problem? Was it actually that you felt tongue-tied, or that you couldn't understand that you said something, but you couldn't understand the answers, or both?
It's like I know how to say it, but I take too much time to think how to say it, so I end up not speaking it. Like
but
not saying.
You understood them better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could learn more phrases, set phrases. This idea of learning chunks. So if you're already at an intermediate level, get a phrase book, start working with sentences, stereotypical interactions, work on specific interactions, dealing with a taxi driver, going to the doctors, whatever it is, you're asking to get Wi-Fi connection, whatever scenarios, and then you can work on those. But learn the set phrases rather than trying to slot the grammar into place, because there isn't time for that, and you probably get it wrong anyway, because you go from Spanish or English, and the way they say it might be completely different. So that's one thing I think that you can do, which might help you. The other thing you can do also is just conversational techniques. So learn a lot of fillers. Things like in English you say, you know what I mean, it's sort of, you know what I mean, you know what I'm saying, do you hear what I'm saying? And things to win you a bit more time. Yeah. And then you can also learn, if the conversation is getting stuck, you can start asking them questions. And if you're not understanding replies, you can try and rephrase. So you could say, so you're saying, so have I understood you? Have I understood you correctly? So you need to learn first the set phrase for that. That I should meet you at the bus stop at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Yeah. So, and then you're repeating it, which helps you reinforce it. And then I say, no, I said 3:30. And then actually also understood, so you don't turn up at the wrong time. So there are techniques, learning chunks, set phrases for specific scenarios, learning the fillers, and actually questioning them, both to take the onus off you, so that you don't have to speak as much yet, because you may just not be ready, but also to confirm comprehension checking questions that you've understood. Okay. And all those things may help you to feel more confident. And then it comes down to continuing with a lot of listening practice for understanding the replies, a lot of reading for widening your vocabulary in context, and just keeping going. You've done it with Japanese, yeah? So you're the expert. What happened then? Did it just take time? Is Korean harder?
I think what happened is that with Japanese, I had someone to speak it. Like I speak it with this person all the time, like in a full day. But I don't have that in Korean. So I think it's harder for me like that.
Yeah. So in a way, as one would expect, really, it's not a mystery for you. You just understand you haven't done as much practice in Korean yet. As you were saying, it's going to take you a bit longer to get there, but it's not really a mystery, and it's not necessarily anything that you're doing wrong. It's just that you don't have the time or the circumstances at this stage to work as intensively as you did with Japanese, but that stage might come later on. Sometimes the thing we can do is just keep going, keep the flame burning, and then we can turn the gas up again later on when life circumstances allow
it. So I think we'll stop the live broadcast. But before we do you want to tell us a little bit about your blog and your channel?
Sure, yeah, thanks a lot. So I've got a website called Dr Popkins How to Get Fluent, so howtogetfluent.com, where I talk about language learning in all its aspects, methods, interviews, and I also cover language learning events on my own language learning projects. So I'm learning Japanese at the moment, and also advanced Russian and German. I've blogged about those, about language exams, about some other methods like shadowing that I've talked about today. And then I've got a YouTube channel which is called Dr Popkins How to Get Fluent. And if you haven't subscribed yet, that would be great if you would. I'm trying to get up to 1,000 subs, so it's still quite a small channel. But it's the same sort of thing, really. And also I do a lot of vlogs from my own travel with a language focus. And I also like to cover big language learner events, language enthusiast events like the Polyglot Gathering or the Polyglot Conference. And so if you're thinking of attending an event like that and you haven't been yet and you want to get a sense of what they're like, then you can find out about those as well over on the channel.
Sorry, I was just plugging in my power cable.
Okay, we lost you there for a moment.
Yeah, I was over at the other side of the room trying to plug myself in. Yeah, I subscribe to your YouTube channel. It's very funny.
Thank you.
I really like it. And obviously we've met a couple of times now as well. Yeah. So. But, okay, so I'm going to start the broadcast. It was lovely to have you all here.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, thanks a lot for contributing. Yeah.